I want to focus in this group on the nature of local investment. And once again, I find myself, and I'm not quite sure whether I should be concerned or the noble Lord Davis should do, but in broad agreement, because the bill places a duty in Clause 2 for LGPS administering authorities to cooperate with strategic authorities, and that's defined in the bill, to identify and develop appropriate investment opportunities in relation to local investments. Now, the bill defines what a local investment is and encourages cooperation, but it doesn't define what constitutes appropriate investment opportunities, how cooperation is to be structured, what's the called governance, and of course governance leads to covenant strength in terms of coupon and thus to viability, so this is quite important, and the metrics for assessing local impact. We need further explanation of what is that duty to cooperate between LGPS authorities, not just within the pool but possibly elsewhere. Because if you just restrict investment opportunities to a local area, as other noble lords have said, it leads you to concentration risk. And that's bad for two reasons. First of all, it's inherently more risky, but also it locks other investors out of the closed shop that then exists between the local pool and its own home strategic authority. I have to ask the noble Lord, the Minister, who I assume is going to respond here, why would the government want to make it harder for a northern pension fund to invest in the south, or probably the other way around, why would it make it really difficult for a southern pool to be able to invest in a northern opportunity? Because, as we heard in the previous group, there are provisions in this bill that will prevent a pool, for a scheme for being involved in any more than one pool. Now, for cooperation, I sometimes read connivance, and that can never be a good thing when you get a statutory and enforced failure of the separation of duties between those selling investment opportunities and those buying them. Thinking more widely, we know there is a national infrastructure bank which is to be morphed into the National Wealth Fund, and I was possibly not alone, as noble lords have been invited to a reception from them in our house on the 28th of January. But the clue's in the name. It's the National Wealth Fund, not the local one. So where might the order of priority be in the funding and financing here? National or local? And when we think about local, we need to have a really deep understanding if we're to start making these investments in greenfield versus brownfield. And I'm concerned about the capacity and capability of funds to manage greenfield development, especially under pooling, is another consequence, a perverse consequence of getting too big. Now, this is where I align myself with Lord Davis, because in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, I proposed amendments that mayoral development corporations could have the financial instruments to go to bodies like pension funds, local pension funds, and issue debt, so we could build affordable housing or new towns or everything. I divided the house. And noble lords on the government side defeated us. So now that the principle of development corporations for the purposes of new towns or affordable housing has been taken off the table, might I ask the noble lords how they intend to legislate to enable these local investment with strategic authorities, because by their votes they've shown to be dead against. But there's more, because I'm very anxious about the definition of a responsible investment, which is in subsection 4 of this clause. Clearly nobody wants irresponsible investment, but what is responsible? Do we prohibit investments in alcohol or tobacco or sugar or supermarkets because they sell the sugar and tobacco and alcohol? Arms or oil or bookmakers, look, I've seen it all before. Everybody has an opinion, and some beneficiary members sometimes think they own the scheme. And there's much virtual signalling to be had, and where long-term returns take a back seat. and resulting in fewer returns and less business ideas with solid, repeatable cash flows, and the poor member and the taxpayer ultimately suffers from the vanity. Now, I've seen with my own eyes the letter writing from these people who purport to tell pension committee members and trustees what they should invest in. But where does it end? It ends in the limits of the constellation of investment ideas. So that everybody else ends up chasing the same stocks in a value-destroying bubble, creating systemic risks with everyone does the same thing. And it ends up with the so-called ethical investment funds that disproportionately have gone into ESG investments, putting those ahead of returns, being the lemons in the market. Yet this is what this bill encourages. There should be no role for ministerial direction in the type of investments. If we want a dynamic economy, you don't create it by wrapping the flow of capital in red tape. Now, if the government wishes to make infrastructure more investable, whether it be national or local, they need to create investable opportunities. Now, I know that toll roads aren't popular. I know a flood defence doesn't pay rent. But the government would be better employed creating new asset classes where desirable investments can be matched with long-term returns, rather than herding them into the same old asset classes. Look, I realise this is a probing amendment, but I do accept that the government should be seeking to promote the alignment between pension funds, affordable housing, new towns, other sort of investment opportunities. But by their actions, they put every obstacle in the way. So I asked the Minister what steps will be taken, presumably when we get back to report, to breathe fresh life into the possibility that was contemplated by the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, where local bodies may issue local bonds for debt or whatever, so we can actually get that flow of capital to make this country richer and not just herding into the same old asset classes that we compete with everybody else for.
My Lord, may I very briefly rise to give my support to Lord Davis, because I think putting money into